In October 1894, deep inside the flood-prone Bitterroot Valley of Ravalli County, Montana, a taciturn blacksmith named Silas Vance, a man capable of bending cold bar iron with bare-knuckle leverage, did something that made the entire territory question his sanity. While the wealthy cattle barons fortified the high benchlands with expensive, multi-thousand-dollar stone retaining walls, Silas abandoned his forge, turned his back on paying clients, and dragged massive hollowed cedar trunks into deep trenches across the lowest, most vulnerable drainage ditch in the territory. The ranchers expected the coming mountain thaw to drown his cursed bottomland first, burying his worthless wooden contraption under 3 feet of stagnant mud. But when an unseasonable Chinook wind liquefied 6 feet of alpine snowpack overnight, sending a 15-foot tidal wave of frozen mud and jagged timber screaming down the canyon, the towering stone estates on the high ground were obliterated in seconds. Yet down in the lowest depression along the river, where every drop of water was guaranteed to pool and destroy the blacksmith's barn, remained bone dry, perfectly anchored inside a roaring ocean of mud. How did a primitive network of hand-carved logs buried 6 feet beneath the clay defeat thousands of tons of violent hydraulic force, keeping dozens of lives safe without a single drop of water breaching the threshold? The lowest parcel in the entire Bitterroot Basin belonged to a solitary blacksmith named Silas Vance. His homestead sat directly inside the natural drainage trough of the Bitterroot River, exactly 2 miles south of the timber settlement of Darby, Montana. Every seasoned rancher in the territory knew that ground was a cursed, waterlogged sinkhole. When the spring rains arrived, the river did not merely rise within its natural banks, it backed up into the basin and sat stagnant for months under 3 feet of murky water. The soil there was thick with heavy blue clay that refused to drain. In summer, the earth baked into rock-hard adobe that cracked under the August sun. In autumn, the surface turned into a slick, treacherous bog that could suck the iron shoe off a draft horse. Every previous homesteader who had attempted to cultivate that bottomland had gone bankrupt within 2 seasons. Silas had bought the land at tax auction for $40 silver when everyone else walked away. Silas understood the geography better than anyone in the Northern Territory. He did not build high stone barricades that would inevitably crumble under saturated lateral soil pressure. He did not haul hundreds of wagon loads of crushed limestone from the quarry to artificially raise his barn foundations. Instead, when the late summer heat turned the soil hard as iron, Silas walked into the virgin timber stands of the Bitterroot Mountains with a 2-man felling saw, an iron wedge, and a single Belgian draft horse. He selected only ancient western red cedar and dense Douglas fir standing near the rocky creek banks. Each tree measured at least 3 feet across the butt and 35 feet in clear, not free length. He felled them by hand, stripped the thick fibrous bark with a barking spud, and skidded the green timber down the steep granite switchbacks into his yard. The steady ringing of his shop anvil ceased entirely, replaced by the relentless gouging of heavy steel chisels against seasoned wood. Silas began boring through the solid center of every 30-foot trunk, using 6-foot hand augers, long iron spoons, and curved draw knives. He was not building furniture, rafters, or feed troughs. He was turning solid forest giants into hollow, smooth-walled conduits. He worked 16 hours every day under the blazing Montana sun without taking a single rest day. Sweat soaked through his heavy canvas shirt, plastering red cedar sawdust to his forearms and weathered face. He spoke to no one on the trail. He ignored the stagecoach drivers who pulled their teams to a halt on the high road just to stare at his bizarre labor. His hands blistered, tore, and hardened into blackened leather. The neighbors began to whisper in the mercantile store down in Darby. They wondered why a master smith who could forge anything from wagon springs to rifle barrels would forfeit $30 a week in prime ironwork just to scrape the heartwood out of dead trees. They believed the mountain solitude had ruined his mind. By mid-September, Silas had gouged out 42 massive trunks, leaving only a dense 2-inch outer shell of resilient cedar. Then, he picked up a flat square-point shovel and began excavating the land by hand. He did not dig a cellar, a root cellar, or an ordinary water well. He excavated 4-foot-wide trenches that wrapped around his barn in 3 concentric rings, snaking downhill toward an abandoned gravel wash 200 yards away. The trenches cut through topsoil, through gray river silt, and deep down into the impermeable blue clay that lined the valley bottom. Silas checked the grade every 10 feet, using a 3-foot brass-bound spirit level and a tightly stretched mason's line. The slope was subtle and exact. Less than 2 inches of vertical fall for every 20 feet of horizontal run. Local farmers shook their heads in disbelief as they hauled their heavy grain wagons past his split-rail fence. They saw a man digging his own moat in a region where winter frost would heave any underground structure to splinters. They called it wasted labor. Caleb Thorne, the wealthiest cattle rancher in Ravalli County, stopped his twin-horse buckboard wagon by the ditch one crisp October morning. Caleb owned 800 acres of prime high benchland, 60 working ranch hands, and 300 head of purebred Hereford cattle. He leaned over the split-rail fence and shouted down into the 6-foot trench where Silas stood knee-deep in freezing blue clay. "You're wasting your life in that ditch, Vance," Caleb shouted, his deep voice carrying across the quiet valley pasture. "When the spring thaw comes roaring down from the Bitterroot peaks, water doesn't follow wood. It rips it right out of the dirt. The first hard freeze will split those logs into matchsticks, and the spring mud will bury you inside your own shop." Silas did not lean on his shovel to argue with the wealthy rancher. He did not glance up at the wagon or offer a single syllable of defensive explanation. He set the brass level against the bottom of the trench, made a precise pencil mark on a cedar stake, and drove his spade back into the wet earth. Caleb spat into the ditch, whipped his team of horses, and drove off toward town, spreading word that the smith had lost his sanity to isolation. Silas continued working through the freezing nights of November without lighting a lantern to keep warm. He joined the hollow trunks end to end inside the deep trenches, using mortise and tenon sleeves sealed with boiling pine pitch and rendered tallow. He fitted heavy oak intake grates at the northern perimeter, facing the natural slope of the mountain runoff. Every joint was anchored into the underlying shale bedrock using hand-forged iron spikes driven through the wood. He backfilled the trenches with coarse river gravel, capped the top layer with 12 inches of packed sod, and concealed the entire network beneath the pasture. To the naked eye, the farm looked completely unchanged, sitting low and helpless in the mouth of the floodway. The surface gave no hint of the engineered labyrinth beneath. The grass grew back over the scar tissue of the trenches. The cattle grazed quietly over 40 tons of buried timber. The entire system lay dormant, waiting for water. How could a primitive underground labyrinth of wood and iron withstand the crushing weight of thousands of tons of hydraulic pressure when the mountains released their snow? Silas was not building a barrier. He was exploiting the immutable laws of fluid dynamics and soil hydrology. He had studied the natural fault lines of the Bitterroot Valley for 15 years, mapping how seasonal water migrated beneath the topsoil before it ever showed on the surface. Traditional earthen dams and stone bulkheads always failed in Montana because they tried to fight the infinite mass of the mountain. Silas designed his system to surrender to the water, capturing its velocity and using its own hydrostatic pressure to siphon it away. Western red cedar contains natural thujoplicins, making the wood virtually rot-proof when submerged in oxygen-depleted soil. When water saturated the outer fibers of the buried trunks, the wood expanded by 4%, sealing the pitch-coated joints tighter than cast iron pipe. The inside of each trunk had been charred with a handheld firebrand to create a vitrified, carbonized surface that reduced friction to near zero. As runoff entered the intake grates on the high north side, it fell into a vertical drop box that forced air out of the pipe. The physics were unyielding. The drop box created a head of 5 vertical feet before the water entered the horizontal run. This vertical drop increased the initial water velocity to 8 feet per second, enough speed to prevent silt from settling inside the log barrel. Silas had calibrated the drop to match the average density of Montana mountain clay. This created a continuous underground siphon that accelerated the water through the narrow wooden throat, pulling surface moisture down through the topsoil like an industrial vacuum. The water was discharged 200 yards south into a dry, subterranean gravel vein that drained harmlessly into the lower river miles below. In late November, the first heavy autumn downpour hit Ravalli County, dumping 3 inches of cold rain in 12 hours. The ranch roads turned into deep soup. Caleb Thorne's lower hay meadows flooded under 4 inches of standing brown water, yet around Silas Vance's forge, the ground remained remarkably firm and dry. The intake grates hummed with a low, vibrating suction, drawing the standing puddles down into the earth as quickly as the clouds could drop them. The barn floor was dry. The cedar timber smelled sweet in the crisp air, and Silas fired his forge for the first time in months. The system functioned flawlessly under moderate load. It proved that his hydraulic calculations were sound, and that his joints could handle 40 gallons per minute without leaking a drop. But there was one terrifying problem. This minor autumn rain was nothing compared to what lay sleeping above them in the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range. The winter of 1894 had just begun, and the mountain snowpack was accumulating at 5 times its normal volume. By the first week of March, the snow depth at the summit of St. Mary Peak exceeded 14 feet of hard-packed blue ice. The high mountain passes were choked with dense avalanches that hung suspended above the valley like an ocean waiting to fall. The winter had been the coldest on territorial record, freezing the mountain ground to a depth of 4 feet beneath the snow. Then, the weather anomaly struck the Bitterroot territory. A fierce, unseasonable Chinook wind tore through the mountain corridor from the west, raising temperatures from 20 degrees below zero to 60 degrees above in less than 30 hours. Warm, torrential rain began to pound the frozen peaks, turning the deep snowpack into a liquid avalanche of mud and timber. The frozen soil beneath the snow could not absorb a single drop of liquid. Every square mile of alpine watershed shed its meltwater directly into the feeder creeks within hours. The creeks swelled into roaring torrents of gray water that tore through the mountain gorges. Down in the valley, the Bitterroot River broke its banks with a sound like rolling artillery fire. The river level rose 16 inches in an hour, carrying entire ponderosa pines, drowned cattle, and chunks of river ice the size of cabins. The muddy deluge spilled over the natural levees and rushed straight toward the low depression of Silas's homestead. Silas stood outside his barn wearing an oiled canvas coat, holding a heavy iron pry bar in his right hand. The ground beneath his heavy work boots began to hum with a low, deep vibration. The first wave of floodwater hit the northern boundary fence, ripping the wooden posts out of the earth like dry matchsticks. The water moved with a terrifying speed across the flat pasture, carrying a front of white foam and tangled root balls. Silas stepped back to the stone threshold of his shop and braced his boots. He felt the cold shockwave through the soles of his feet before the water reached his toes. The buried cedar network engaged instantly, swallowing the first 1,000 gallons with a deep, hollow roar that echoed through the soil. But an unexpected disaster appeared in the very first 10 minutes. The mountain flood was not clean water. It carried thousands of tons of topsoil, thick gravel, and razor-sharp pine splinters scraped from the logging cuts above. This heavy, abrasive sludge slammed against the northern intake grates. The iron mesh caught the largest debris, but within minutes, a thick mat of river grass, pine needles, and sticky blue clay plastered itself over the intake openings. The hydraulic suction that made the system work now worked against it. The immense vacuum pulled the debris tighter against the iron bars, sealing the grates like a plaster cast. The water could no longer enter the subterranean conduits. With the intakes blinded, the water could no longer enter the subterranean conduits. The flood had nowhere to go. It backed up across the north pasture in a brown, foaming wave that rose 8 inches every 3 minutes. The water crept past the anvil stump, over the threshold of the tool shed, and reached the bottom planks of the main barn doors. Caleb Thorne and 3 of his hired hands rode their horses along the high ridge, half a mile away, watching the muddy tide engulf the Smiths' property. They saw Silas standing alone in the rising current, struggling against the flow with his bare hands. His crazy contraption has choked. One of the cowhands yelled through the howling wind. "The whole barn is going under before midnight." Caleb laughed bitterly through the downpour, pointing his riding crop at the sinking yard. "I told him wood wouldn't hold a mountain. Let him drown in his own ditch." Silas did not look at the ridge. He waded into the waist-deep, freezing torrent with his heavy pry bar held firmly across his chest. The current was so violent it nearly swept his 200-pound frame off his feet into the flood. He reached the submerged north pit, where the main intake was buried under a foot of swirling mud. He plunged his bare arms into the freezing water to tear away the packed debris by hand. The suction of the pipe beneath was immense, pulling with hundreds of pounds of hydraulic force. The vacuum suddenly grabbed his left sleeve, pinning his arm against the steel grate underwater. He could not pull free. The freezing water rose to his chin. The weight of the current pushed against his chest, forcing air from his lungs. His boots slipped on the smooth clay stones at the bottom of the pit. If Silas could not break free and clear the intake without getting dragged into the subterranean mouth, the pressure would burst the buried cedar joints and collapse the entire foundation of the homestead. Cold mud burned in Silas's lungs as he leveraged the iron pry bar against the lip of the stone pit. He used his right shoulder as a fulcrum and threw his entire body weight backward against the current. The heavy canvas of his sleeve tore with a sharp crack, freeing his arm from the deadly suction. He scrambled to his feet in the freezing current and dragged a set of specialized, heavy iron deflector screens from the shop door. He had forged these screens during the long winter nights, angular wedge-shaped grates with reverse slanting steel tines. Each screen weighed over 80 pounds of solid Swedish bar iron. Silas dragged them through 3 feet of swirling mud, his boots digging into the clay bed of the ditch. He positioned the apex of the first iron wedge directly against the oncoming current. Silas drove the iron screens into the bedrock directly in front of the cedar intakes using an 8-pound sledgehammer. The heavy blows rang out over the roar of the river. The wedge shape created an eddy that forced floating timber and heavy gravel to slide off to the sides, while allowing the liquid sludge to enter the pipes unobstructed. The siphon re-established itself with a thunderous gulp that sounded like a steam engine. The water level in the yard stopped rising. Within 12 minutes, the brown lake around the barn receded, sucked down into the 3 concentric log conduits, and thrown out into the deep gravel vein 200 yards south. The vortex above each intake spun with such violence that it pulled whirlpools 2 feet deep into the floodwater. Pine cones and small branches were sucked down into the pipes and spit out harmlessly into the lower canyon wash. The surface of the yard cleared. The yard drained until only a half-inch film of wet mud covered the gravel driveway. Silas leaned against the barn door, his hands raw and bleeding from the freezing water, his chest heaving under his wet shirt. The horses inside the barn stopped their frantic stamping. The system had held against the first wave. He wiped the mud from his face with a torn sleeve and checked the inspection port inside the workshop floor. The underground water was moving at incredible velocity, generating a draft of cold air that blew up through the floorboards. Then, a sharp, gunshot-like crack echoed from beneath the heavy wooden floor. Silas knelt and pressed his ear to the oak planks. The sound was unmistakable. The massive pressure inside the central log conduit was stressing the cedar mortise joints to their absolute structural limits. The hydraulic head from the upper hill had increased the internal water pressure beyond 60 pounds per square inch. The wood was groaning under the internal load. The soil above the buried pipes began to pulse like a living artery. Every surge of water from the upper pasture sent a shockwave through the clay backfill, lifting the floorboards a 1/16 of an inch with every pulse. Small jets of muddy water began to shoot upward through the seams in the barn floor, spraying cold mist into the rafters. The subterranean joints were weeping, threatening to blow the backfill apart from the inside out. The system was running at 95% of its absolute braking capacity, and Silas had no more relief valves to open. The wood was screaming. Yet this was still only the runoff from the lower foothills. Up in the high canyon, the ancient natural ice dam holding back the mountain reservoir at Tin Cup Creek was beginning to buckle under 5 million tons of meltwater. At 10 o'clock that night, an explosion like rolling thunder rolled down from the heights of the Bitterroot Range. The natural glacial dam at Tin Cup Creek, weakened by 48 hours of warm rain, collapsed completely. A 15-foot wall of black water, uprooted ponderosa pines, and giant granite boulders roared out of the narrow canyon mouth at 40 miles per hour. It did not follow the meandering curves of the riverbed. It took the straightest path down the valley floor, crushing everything in its path. The shockwave of compressed air ahead of the flood knocked down cedar sheds and tore roofs off barns before the water even struck. The roar drowned out the sound of the thunder and the howling wind. The high ground was no longer safe. Caleb Thorne's multi-$1,000 stone retaining walls, built by professional masons to protect his master estate, crumbled in seconds under the direct impact of the wave. His hay barns were ripped from their cedar posts and smashed into floating debris. 80 head of cattle were swept into the current, their frantic bellows drowned out by the roar of the water. Caleb, his family, and 7 of his ranch hands were forced onto their horses in the pitch black, fleeing for their lives as the flood devoured their high pastures. The stone manor house that Caleb had bragged would stand for a century collapsed inward as the water undercut its mortar foundations. His wagons, his winter grain stores, and his prized thoroughbred horses were tossed into the black current like autumn leaves. The tidal wave swept directly toward the low basin where Silas Vance's property sat. As the main surge hit the perimeter, the discharge channel at the southern end of the property suffered a catastrophic failure. The lower gravel vein, overwhelmed by the total volume of the valley flood, stopped accepting water. The river backed into the outlet pipes. The outflow reversed. Thousands of gallons of pressurized river water slammed backward into the buried cedar logs, colliding with the inflow coming down from the north. The collision of 2 opposing water columns inside a closed pipe generates a destructive hydraulic phenomenon known as water hammer. When the two waves met beneath Silas's barn, the internal pressure spiked to over 120 pounds per square inch. The clash of opposing hydraulic pressures beneath the farm caused the ground to violently shudder. The sod in the center of the horse paddock bulged upward like an enormous blister, stretching 3 feet high before tearing open in a geyser of mud. Iron spikes that held the joints were sheared off under the sudden shockwave. Silas felt the barn foundation shift an inch beneath his boots. The subterranean pressure was now trying to blow the entire farm into the sky. The earth was splitting. Fissures 2 inches wide opened across the gravel yard. Black, sulfur-smelling water bubbled out of the cracks in steady geysers, filling the air with the stench of stagnant river silt. The barn frame groaned from ridgepole to sill. Through the blinding rain, Silas saw lantern lights bobbing wildly in the dark. A dozen horses and a terrified group of men, women, and surviving livestock were stumbling down the hillside directly toward his submerged fence line. It was Caleb Thorne, his family, and his exhausted crew, running out of dry ground as the mountain flood cut off their escape to the town of Darby. They were heading straight into the lowest, most dangerous depression in the county, seeking refuge at the only building still standing. Caleb was leading his horse on foot, carrying his crying 6-year-old daughter wrapped in a soaked woolen blanket. Behind him, 50 head of panicked steers were crowding together against the rising tide, their horns clashing in the dark. If Silas could not equalize the internal pressure within the next 10 minutes, the entire underground log network would explode, pulling the barn, the people, and the animals down into an inescapable sinkhole of boiling mud. The rain fell in unbroken sheets, turning the midnight sky into a suffocating shroud. The temperature began to plummet again as the cold tail of the storm swept in, freezing the mud into thick, razor-edged slush. The wind shrieked through the eaves of the barn, stripping cedar shakes from the roof and hurling them into the dark. The entire valley was an ocean of black, moving water punctuated by the screams of livestock and the snapping of ancient trees. Caleb Thorne dragged his trembling wife and daughter toward the blacksmith's yard, his face pale and caked with river grime. His expensive boots were gone, his horse was bleeding from the flank, and his voice was reduced to a ragged scream. Vance. Open the doors. Caleb hammered on the reinforced oak planks of the barn with the butt of an empty lantern. The upper benches are gone. The whole mountain is coming down the wash. Silas threw open the heavy double doors, bracing them with 6-inch iron pins. He did not ask questions. He did not demand an apology. He pulled the terrified women and children inside the warm, dry perimeter of the barn and directed the men to herd 40 surviving cattle and horses into the rear pens. The animals were shivering, their eyes wide with terror, their hooves slipping on the wet clay ramps. But the moment their weight settled onto the barn floor, the structural balance beneath the earth deteriorated rapidly. 40 tons of livestock and human cargo pressed down on the saturated soil above the trembling cedar conduits. The floor joists groaned in agony. A deafening pop echoed from the center aisle as another underground iron bracket snapped under the combined stress of surface load and internal hydraulic pressure. Water began bubbling through the floorboards at 3 separate points, pooling around the cattle's hooves. The entire barn was floating on an unstable cushion of pressurized mud. The foundation groaned. Caleb Thorne stared at the water rising through the floor in horror. "We're going down," he whispered, clutching his daughter's shoulder. "The whole ground is turning to porridge." Silas knew there was only one impossible option left. When he designed the system, he had installed a master safety gate, an emergency hydrostatic relief valve set 20 feet deep inside the central junction box, located dead in the middle of the raging north ditch. If that valve could be manually forced open, the excess pressure would bypass the compromised barn lines and vent the entire surge into an auxiliary deep-bed siphon that led to the old river canyon. The auxiliary siphon was a 4-foot wide hollow Douglas fir conduit set deep into the gravel bedrock. It had never been opened to water. Its timber was dry, clamped shut by a 300-pound iron gate that kept back pressure from entering the system. The valve was locked down with a 4-inch forged iron dog-leg bolt to prevent accidental opening. The handle was submerged under 4 feet of freezing, debris-choked floodwater at the center of the outer current. Silas stripped off his heavy coat, grabbed a 30-pound sledgehammer, and tied a 1-inch hemp rope around his waist. He secured the other end of the rope around the massive 12-by-12 central post of the barn frame. He handed the bitter end of the line to Caleb Thorne and his ranch hands. Silas looked Caleb dead in the eye through the howling wind. "Do not let go of this rope," Silas said, speaking his first words of the night. "No matter what happens out there." The men gripped the coarse hemp with white knuckles, knowing that if Silas failed to reach that valve, they would all be swallowed by the collapsing foundation within minutes. Silas stepped out of the dry barn into the teeth of the flood. The cold mountain water hit his chest like a slab of iron, stealing the breath from his throat. The current dragged him 3 feet downstream instantly, but the hemp rope pulled taut, biting into his ribs. The cold was paralyzing, 40-degree glacier melt that numbed the nerves in his legs within 10 seconds. He leaned his body 45 degrees into the current, dragging the 30-pound hammer behind him with his right hand. He fought his way forward inch by inch, planting his heavy boots into the churning gravel. The water was carrying heavy logs, broken fence posts, and jagged blocks of river ice that struck his legs with bone-crushing force. He reached the location of the central junction box. It was completely buried beneath a boiling maelstrom of brown water and floating wreckage. Silas took a deep breath, ducked below the surface, and reached into the freezing dark. His fingers found the steel access plate. He felt the heavy iron dog-leg bolt. It was jammed solid, twisted sideways by the enormous hydraulic force pushing up from the cedar logs below. The current ripped at his hair and shoulders. He could not get leverage underwater. He was forced to surface to fill his burning lungs with rain and cold air. Silas surfaced, gasping for air, spat a mouthful of silt, and raised the 30-pound sledgehammer above his head in the middle of the raging current. His footing was slipping. The gravel beneath his boots was washing away. Inside the barn, 40 people held their breath in total silence. Through the open door, they could hear the terrible sound of the mountain, a deep, low rumble that shook the teeth in their skulls. The crest of the main canyon surge, a 10-foot wall of black mud and crushed rock, had just broken past the upper tree line, 300 yards away, racing downhill straight at the blacksmith's barn. The wave tore through the outer cottonwood grove, snapping 3-foot thick trunks like dried twigs and hurling them ahead of the crest. The ground shook with the force of an earthquake. Could 5 buried wooden logs hold against 10,000 tons of crashing mountain rock? Or would the entire homestead disintegrate on impact? Silas swung the 30-pound hammer underwater with every ounce of muscle in his broad back. The blow struck the iron bolt with a dull, heavy thud that reverberated through the bedrock. The steel did not move. The shock of the blow traveled up the hickory handle, numbing his wrists and tearing the skin on his palms. The water was rising over his shoulders now. He had seconds left before the wave hit. He raised the hammer a second time, ignoring the searing pain in his torn shoulder muscles. The wall of water was now 200 yards away, stripping ancient ponderosa pines from the soil and tossing them into the air like twigs. Silas brought the hammer down a second time, with all his weight. The forged iron bolt cracked in half with a sharp metallic snap. The emergency valve plate blew open instantly under 50 pounds of back pressure. A violent, spinning vortex opened in the water above Silas's head, creating a massive suction cone that pulled his legs toward the open shaft. The steel plate flew 20 feet through the muddy water. Silas fought against the downward pull of the siphon, clawing his fingers into the gravel bottom to keep from being drawn down into the 4-foot conduit. The auxiliary cedar conduit's 2 4-foot wide hollowed fir trunks set at a 30-degree angle into the deep gravel engaged with an earth-shaking roar. The vacuum was so powerful it began drawing thousands of gallons of water per second straight out of the surface current. At that exact second, the 10-foot crest of the main canyon flood slammed into the northern perimeter of the farm. The impact sounded like 2 freight trains colliding at full speed. A wave of brown water and splintered timber exploded 30 feet into the air. The shockwave knocked Silas flat into the current. The rope around his waist jerked tight with the force of a snapped steel cable, dragging the central barn post 2 inches into the floor. Inside the barn, women screamed, and the cattle threw themselves against the heavy cedar stalls. The water hit the outer walls of the building with immense violence, rising 3 feet up the exterior planks in a fraction of a second. Caleb Thorne and the men pulled on the hemp rope with everything they had, dragging Silas's half-drowned body through the open barn doors just as the main surge enveloped the property. They slammed the heavy doors shut and dropped the 6-inch iron crossbars into place. The water outside was roaring like a living monster. But inside the barn, the miracle of fluid mechanics took control. Instead of shattering the walls, the massive hydrostatic pressure of the flood forced the water directly into Silas's underground intake network. The hollow cedar logs did not resist the river. They swallowed it. The high-velocity siphons drew the water down into the earth before it could exert lateral force against the barn's foundation. The 3 concentric rings of buried logs acted as an invisible hydraulic moat. The flood split into 2 massive currents that curved around the perimeter of the buildings, accelerated through the underground flumes, and discharged with volcanic force into the deep canyon wash 200 yards below. The subterranean cedar trunks bent, groaned, and expanded under the titanic load, but the mortise joints and iron brackets held. The charred internal walls of the pipes allowed the mud to slide through without sticking or creating friction dams. For 45 minutes, the Bitterroot River poured its full fury against the low parcel of land. Tons of boulders rolled across the pasture, diverted harmlessly along the hardened stone aprons Silas had buried beneath the grass. The earth beneath the cattle remained solid and level. The livestock stopped their panicked bellowing and settled down into the dry straw, chewing their cud as the world outside was torn to pieces. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the deep subterranean roar began to change pitch. The violent vibration in the floorboards softened from a sharp hammer into a steady, rhythmic hum. The emergency siphon had drained the head of the flood. The main wave had passed down the valley, leaving Silas Vance's barn standing like an island of solid oak in the middle of a destroyed world. When the first pale light of dawn cut through the thinning storm clouds over the Bitterroot Range, a dead silence settled across Ravalli County. The devastation across the territory was absolute. Every high bench ranch within 4 miles had been scoured down to the bare shale. Caleb Thorne's multi-$1,000 stone manor house was reduced to a scattered pile of river cobbles. Miles of post and rail fences were gone. The county road had been erased from the map, replaced by a half-mile wide canyon of wet mud and tangled debris. The timber mills at Darby were completely destroyed, their saw pits buried under 10 feet of mountain silt. up and down the Bitterroot Valley, survivors were clinging to high cottonwood trees or sitting on the roofs of drowned cabins. Silas Vance lifted the heavy iron bar and pushed open the massive barn doors. The morning air was freezing, clean, and filled with the smell of wet pine and rich river silt. He stepped outside holding a dented tin lantern. The yard around his barn was firm, compacted gravel. The water level had dropped to barely an inch of clear runoff trickling over the grass. Inside the barn, 40 men, women, and children walked out onto the threshold in total disbelief. Not a single animal had been lost. Not a single tool in the forge was wet. Every life that had taken shelter inside the low, cursed depression had survived without a scratch. Caleb Thorne walked out into the pale morning light, looking at the barren waste where his empire had stood only 12 hours before. He looked down at the firm ground beneath his feet, and then at the subtle grass mounds that hid the buried cedar trunks. The proudest man in the Montana Territory dropped to his knees in the mud in front of the silent blacksmith. Caleb grabbed Silas's battered, calloused hands in his own, tears cutting clean lines through the dried muck on his cheeks. "You built an ark under our feet, Silas," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. "And we called you a fool." The buried cedar logs had done what millions of dollars in stone walls and arrogance could never achieve. By understanding the physics of the earth instead of trying to conquer it, a quiet man with a chisel and 20 trees had saved the future of the valley. Silas Vance did not answer. He pulled his hands gently away from the rancher, picked up his leather apron from the bench, and tied it around his waist. He walked over to his cold forge, struck a match, and touched it to the dry pine shavings beneath the coal. He pumped the leather bellows until a bright, golden flame leapt into the morning sky. He took his heavy iron hammer from the rack and struck the anvil once, the clear, ringing note echoing across the silent Bitterroot Valley. True wisdom does not argue with the crowd. It builds in silence, waits for the storm, and lets the work speak for itself.